how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and today we are gonna cover the latest album by Taylor Swift, Folklore. This is a big album in the whole entire, music blogosphere, pop world, country world too, maybe indie world, maybe. It's been out for a while already, though, so I just needed some time to process it. But before we get into this review, I just want to let everyone know that the last episode I dropped was Best and Worst Track of the Week for the week of August 1st. And also the previous episode prior to that was for Ellie Goulding's pretty good, fourth album titled Brightest Blue. I had some thoughts on that. If you want to check out that review, go ahead and do that. And we will get started. Alright, everyone, so the album is titled Folklore. The artist is Taylor Swift. This album was released on July 24th, 2020. It was a surprise album that no one really was expecting or anticipating, no lead singles or anything like that, by, of course, the pop star, singer-songwriter, country mogul, or former country mogul Taylor Swift. And this is a stylistic change, to say the least, for Taylor Swift. This album in particular leans heavily towards a folk or indie, acoustic pop aesthetic, and it's something that we haven't really seen too much of Taylor Swift. Also, it really doesn't pander to something that is supposed to be played on the radio or something of that nature that is supposed to, appeal to the maybe younger crowd. This is very much an album that maybe was geared towards people kind of my age in our mid 20s to maybe mid 30s or late 30s, even, due to it being, very derivative of a lot of material that came out in maybe the late 90s and 2000s. That was like folky, indie, singer songwriter type stuff. Um, and I just should note here before we delve more into this, the producers on here were listed as Aaron Destner, Jack Antonoff, and Taylor Swift. Um, the two big ones that we should focus on are Jack Antonoff of Bleachers and Fun fame. I should put maybe a disclaimer just because I'll probably be dealing with a lot of Antonoff's work throughout this podcast. As I'm not the biggest fan of Antonoff, as a artist. His production has never really bothered me too much. We'll get into this here. But overall, I just was never very fond of Bleachers when they were blowing up in the mid 2010s. Aaron Dessner is of the band The National. He is one of the songwriters and I think guitar players. The National is a band I respect, but I haven't really been too crazy about because I just haven't really took the time to listen to all their albums and just I haven't really been, I guess, geared to listen to all their albums either. I think their music is fine, but I've never gotten to the point where I'm just like, wow, I really need to throw on some National, or I need to throw on some of the National. But anytime their music comes on, I don't necessarily mind it. So just got that part out of the way. So let's start from the very beginning to or to who Taylor Swift is and what she means to the overall music world. She is an American singer-songwriter, pop star, former country star. That was signed all the way. That was signed all the way back when she was just 15 years old to a record deal. Now it's, I guess, a little unnecessary to go too deep into her backstory because she's a household name. Most people know who she is, and they know at least some of her songs. But to kind of give a cliff notes of Taylor Swift overall, her self-titled debut album in the 2000s was the longest charting album in the 2000s on the Billboard 200. Her second album, Fearless, is probably one of her most iconic, just to the fact that she had two huge singles, Love Story and You Belong With Me, that were crossover hits, meaning they did well on the country side and the pop side. And I feel like it's worth mentioning right now. Taylor Swift was a country artist to begin with, and I don't know if her career was ever intended to cross over. I think it was just a clever, I guess, marketing or sales tactic, just because of her appeal with her tracks. And I remember even "You Belong with Me" had two versions, I think, that were played on contemporary pop radio as well as country radio, um, and it worked. And I guess going back all the way to Fearless, it was already kind of written in the stars that Taylor would one day possibly step out of the Nashville world and transcend that. And I'd say she certainly did that, and that's quite phenomenal because I can't really think of many artists that have ever done that or have done that. The Let's see, Fearless won her four. It was the best-selling album in 2009, and it won her four Grammy awards. So that's quite an achievement right there. Over the years, her commercial success has been consistent, hasn't really stopped. If anything, she's just grown bigger. She has appealed to someone like me, even that I would say I am not a huge pop music fan, or back in my childhood and growing up, I would say I detested it at that point in my life. But I could say in most of her albums, with the side maybe Reputation, I have found to enjoy tracks that I have taken at least one or two off of each album, such as like Starlight from Red, the pop bangers from 1989, um, her earlier tracks like Teardrops on My Guitar, Love Story, yada yada yada. You get the point. So yeah, Reputation was maybe one that I didn't really delve too into, possibly because Look What You Made Me Do was kind of one of the tracks that I just never really saw the appeal, and I just thought it was trash, honestly. But the album certainly probably has more tracks that are better than that track. Nonetheless, before I got into this album review, I just wanted to visit her previous album, Lover, and just kind of see what was up with that. I only really knew one song was the one with Panic at the Disco, and I felt like maybe the album wasn't for me. But I listened to it right before I did this review, and I'd say that it was a solid pop album overall. I think at times I maybe enjoyed it a little bit more than Folklore, but there's a hint of maturity. There's some stylistic experimentation going on. The title track "Lover" kind of alluded to like this stylistic shift that would become Folklore, I think. So maybe she dropped some hints, or maybe something else happened. But nonetheless, Folklore as an album, it's something that I was kind of struggling to figure out what was trying to be done here. And overall, Folklore has struck me as an album that could have possibly been something authentic that Taylor Swift really wanted to release, that showed a side of her that maybe she couldn't before due to like record contracts and stuff like that. She had to be charting and she had to play the most radio friendly stuff. Honestly, I would like to think that's true, but there's so many issues that I think have to be addressed. Mainly, my biggest issue from this album was the production. Um, all the songs, if not maybe one or two, there is little to no low end, meaning you can't hear anything lower than the low frequencies on the piano because most of the tracks are piano based. I'm sure there's something in there thrown in, like a very light bass or something, but you can't hear it, and it gives like a sort of unfulfilled, uh, I guess, yearning for that throughout the whole entire experience. Um, and it just throws a lot of things off because you get a very stale songwriting process, or not, well, I guess it kind of affects the songwriting process probably because you're just limiting yourself to piano and then a vocal line that is thrown right in the mix that just covers everything up, because there is some pretty instrumentation and like some compositions on this album. But it's kind of predictable after a while. You kind of see the tricks in the bag and the overall aesthetic that it's going for, but it kind of affects the overall energy and the compositions overall, especially when you're trying to appeal more emotionally on this album, because this is somewhat of a sad album, and you're trying to change up your style, but you're kind of doing it in a way that I don't see how it benefits the songs when you have these tracks where you just have Taylor's voice covering a lot of things, and then the only thing underneath it is like piano. And a lot of times it's not very interesting piano, it's just chords played, or it's very predictable performed piano. Um, but let's take it by a lot of the tracks that I felt were highlights. Starting with the first track, the one. Um, Immediately, I have issues with like the overbearingness of the drums and the cheapness of it. They're just really clicky. Uh, they just don't really give much. They don't give anything to the song to make it more interesting. Uh, it's heavily reliant on this very ostinato chord progression that's constantly played over and over. There's some poppy flair to it, especially with the vocal line that Taylor sings. Light guitar licks thrown in. Hardly no low end. It starts immediately right here in the first track. Um, it keeps like a melancholic mood. It's a little hazy-ish, I believe. And then we get the track Cardigan, which I believe is one of the more successful tracks on this album. I think it's possibly going to do really well in the top 40 or in the Billboard Hot 100 when we get there. If you follow Best and Worst Track of the Week, I guarantee it's going to be on here. But, anyways, automatically I get another gist of what this album is really uh, deriving from. I get very similar uh, vibes from Sufjan Stevens, the folk artist. I think immediately it kind of reminds me of the album Carrying Lowell. Um, I believe that's the name of it. Um, anyways, it kind of just reminds me of this whole aesthetic with like these folky, I guess, colors and instrumentation. Uh, Overall, the track I enjoyed the melodic piano in the track. The percussion sounds a little bit less cheap. It's still really light on the low end overall. But I do like the contrast with the piercing synths that are provided in the track to the sound of the overall song. The bridge is good. It has like this adult alternative singer-songwriter like genre thing going on at its core, I think, but it's really cool that it has organic instrumentation with some modern production thrown in. The ending outro I enjoyed as well. The next highlight I liked, or I want to talk about, is Exile featuring Bon Iver, another folk artist that is, huge in the indie world. I liked, well, it was interesting hearing the low end on Bon Iver's low end. It's immediately there in the beginning of the track. He sounds like a country artist. It's really interesting because it sounds like he could, if he wanted to, cross over. I don't think that ever happened though. It's a piano-based track. I like the nice folklore that Taylor adds when they sing together. It has a somber mood overall. Unfortunately, in the track, it feels like the build-up just seems a little bit forced. It doesn't evoke much as when I'm listening to it. Um, the piano is performed with like a hint of predictability. The chorus is earwormy though, so I think it's kind of like a more accessible track. Compositionally, it's just really simple. The next track after that, My Tears Ricochet, was another track I would want to talk about. The intro sounds like the siren calls from Frozen. I don't know if that was intentional, but I could not shake that. The song gets better when the percussive elements come in, and I feel like that's a general just issue I have with the album too. A lot of it just is just stale, and you get like in the first 30 seconds of a track, you get what you get. You've already heard what you heard a lot of the melodies that Taylor is gonna sing. You hear a lot of the instrumentation. You hear the chords, and that's it. And then sometimes in the outros, you'll get like some sort of percussive, texture that's thrown in. that makes the track interesting. This happens in this track. It's the texture's super light overall. The low end is gone, no low end. The song is pretty consistent in terms of color and overall mood. Saying you get what you get. Not much development. And then Taylor's vocals are brought to the forefront over everything. They're not too interesting. The vocal performances are great on this album, but there's nothing else that happens in terms of like development in the tracks. I guess interesting melodic lines, stuff like that. It's a little barren sounding. Um, and the next track, I'm not gonna go too deep into it, but Mirrorball, no low end at all. The production is washed out, and it sounds very like I don't know how to explain it. It's washed out, and it does not sound like it's working for the actual song. It's really hard to get over. Seven. Here's another song where I thought it was another obvious Sufjan Stevens influence. Has a folky nature to it. The verse of the song becomes very poppy, especially with the syntax that is used in her verses. The instrumentation has like a light melodic piano and mandolin, which is another characteristics of that Sufjan Stevens album. It's an interesting track, and it gets better more when the percussion kicks in. This is a prime example of that point I was making. Um, I think the lyrics were a little bit cheesy on here, but I guess I could have got past that. It wasn't that big of a deal. Um, August was an interesting track because it has like this '90s aesthetic. It gives me similarities to that one track from the '90s, "You and I Always Forever." By The track was by Donna Lewis. The actual name of the track was "I Love You Always Forever." Anyways, I think a lot of the melodies are similar. The bridge buildup has an enthusiastic performance. Probably one of the better. It's probably one of the better tracks of the album. Everything sounds really light. Uh, the instrumentation, uh, the instrumentation, honestly could have been more brought out. Just if you can hear like a lot of the interesting things going on in it, like in the mids. Um, and another characteristic of the song is it kind of aims to be hooky, especially in those courses with that bouncy vocal line. Um, Overall, I thought it was a decent track. Uh, the next track, right after that, "This Is Me Trying." I thought that was another interesting one. It has an ambience to it where it's kind of like dream pop. It's interesting. She's playing with the that aesthetic as well, with these reverb soaked vocals and nice melodic vocal line. It has a matureness to it compared to like a lot of her past material. Uh, it's a very lush moment in the album. It's layered with strings and brass, and it doesn't have any piano, which I felt like was something maybe she could have done more of. It would have made the album a lot more interesting. Um, we're gonna skip Illicit Affairs. I didn't think that one was too interesting. Invisible String, I liked this song. It had a very folky aesthetic to it. A lot more elements of Sufjan Stevens. Um, Nice vocal melody, singing those verses, very pretty. Nice change in color in the bridge as well. Some development that goes on. Again, almost no low end, um, but a change of, I guess, structure in her songwriting. Um, we'll skip over Mad Woman. Um, that one wasn't too. Uh, it's probably one of the more talked about tracks on the song, but I'm just gonna go to Epiphany. I think this was probably the worst track on this album. Instrumentally, it's really uninteresting. It's Compositionally same, very uninteresting. It's weird because I think this track is trying to give like a religious point of view, especially in the lyrics. You might get that. But it sounds almost like church music. If I can put it in, I guess, in a metaphor, it's like if there was a composition written to train specifically middle to high school age children that are in choir, learning to sing classically, or just learning to sing as a choir. Um, it's like if something was written for that, but Taylor Swift just took the piece and sang it by herself. Um, it, it just seems like it was like some sort of etude or something like that, where it was just meant to train. It's the song is just super boring. It doesn't develop. It doesn't even feel like an actual song. It's like if it was just written for the purpose of being sung so that they can train a teenage choir at the church. And This was a song that was simple enough, slow harmonic, rhythms, uh, very simple melodic melodies that don't change at all, and they're just using it because it sounds pretty. And if they pull it off, it'll sound all right. Everyone in the church will think it's nice. Um, it's a really boring track. The album literally did not need it. But on a positive note, the next track, Betty, is probably one of the best Taylor Swift songs I've heard in a long time. It's vintage Taylor like. It sounds like something that could have been on her debut album. There's some nice organic instrumentation. Everything accompanies the vocals so well. There's some interesting lyrical content from someone else's perspective. It's one of the better written tracks on here. It has a storytelling nature. It feels sincere. There's a nice key change in it, a nice build up, and it's energetic. And uh, this track is good because I feel like it has energy to it. It has some dynamics. It's fulfilling a lot of what's needed on a lot of these tracks. Um, the track after that piece didn't really stick out to me. Hoax is the last track on this album, and it kind of just ends with the same thing that happens constantly. It doesn't really, uh, it doesn't really strike me as a closing track, but it's more of like the John Stevens influence. It has a pretty piano melody, gorgeous string passages. I'll give it that, but it's still quite underwhelming. Um, it's pretty aesthetics, but it's not very interesting. The songs just don't go anywhere, and it's. I feel like so much more could have been done. And even though I've been very critical of this album, I don't think it's a bad album. Um, it's interesting to see Taylor Swift do this. I wish when doing this, this could have been done, I guess, a little bit more dynamic, just a little bit contrast from track to track. But it works because she's getting great critical reception, I think, for this. So um, I wouldn't be surprised if this is something she does more of. But overall, I think this album's a 5 out of 10. It's not terrible. It's really not bad, but it's to me it's not very good either in the sense that I would there's stuff on here that I want to listen to a lot or I'm just impressed or wowed. I don't really get any wow on this album. But that's just my opinion. I'm just a dude talking about music. Um, and Taylor Swift is probably exponentially more talented than me in you know in every sense of the word. But anyways, yeah. Uh, Interesting to see where it'll be interesting to see where she goes from here. But just take the my criticisms with a grain of salt too. I got a little bit passionate in this interview or in this review. But if you stuck around to the very end, did you like this album? Um, did you hate it? I don't know. Take care of yourselves. I'll be doing probably some more reviews this week. I took a little bit of a break between here and Best and Worst Track of the Week, but I have another idea for worth a listen to coming up. So thanks for listening to the Music Brew podcast, and I'll see you guys later.